Now, the next big step in building out our application is to build out our entire feed. But before doing that, I want to finish one small part of our individual posts, and that is this options dialog. So whenever we select this, for a user that we're following, we'll see this unfollow option. If we're looking at our own post, we want to see a delete option to be able to delete our post. And then if we're not following someone and it's not our own post, we don't want to see anything. So let's head over to our options dialog. And we haven't created the mutation to delete a post yet, but we can set up a lot before we do that. First of all, we can bring in the current user ID from user context. We'll import user context from 2 levels up. And we'll grab the current user ID. We'll say that we are the owner if the current user ID is equal to the author ID. Now note, we want to pass down for our post, so back in our post component, when we're displaying our options dialog, we want to pass through 2 more props. We want to pass through the post ID, which is just going to be ID, and the author ID, which is going to be the user's ID, user.id. So we can destructure those 2 values here in the props, author ID and post ID. So we're the owner if the current user's ID is equal to the author. We're looking at our own post, and therefore we want to set the button and set the text to their appropriate value. So the button text, first of all, if we're the owner, is going to be delete, otherwise it's going to be unfollow. And for the onClick, for the function that we're going to call, if we're the owner, we want to delete the post, so we want to maybe have a function called handle delete post. Otherwise, we want to pass a reference to one called handle unfollow user. So we'll make both of those underneath. And then if we're not following someone, or we're not the user of the post, the owner of the post, we want to have a variable called isUnrelatedPost or isUnrelatedUser if it's not the owner, if we're not the owner, and not isFollowing. And again, we can get isFollowing by taking the following IDs and then iterating over it with sum and checking to see whether the ID is equal to the author ID. If it is, and we're following them, we want to make sure that both of these values are true if we say that they're an unrelated user, and we can easily hide the button if it's an unrelated user by providing the following condition: if not is unrelated user, then show the button. So we have everything that we need in order to unfollow the user. We just need use mutation. So we'll import that and grab unfollow user. So we'll get that function, unfollow user. Here we're going to need to collect the variables, and those are going to be user ID to follow, and that's going to be author ID, as well as the current user ID that we're getting from context. And then we can call unfollow user with those variables, and then finally we want to close the dialog with onClose. Now deleting a post is going to be a little bit different. We haven't covered that just yet, but the mutation is going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be one called delete post. Now I'm going to write this all out by hand, but you can certainly write yours in the console. There's going to be a mutation called delete post, and it's just going to accept the post ID of type UUID and user ID of type UUID. We want to delete posts where the ID is equal to the post ID, and also the user ID is equal to the user ID. Pretty straightforward. And we want to just return affected rows. Now we're also going to, thinking about this critically, we're also going to need to delete all of the related likes, as well as saved posts, as well as notifications that are related to a given post. So we want to delete likes. We can actually copy this above. It's going to be an even simpler version of this mutation. We want to delete posts, but we also want to delete likes just where the ID is equal to post ID. We don't need to include the user ID too. And we can copy this and do the same for saved posts and for notifications. Post ID equal to post ID. So that was my mistake. So let's save all that, and we can, back in options dialog, wire up this mutation. We'll bring in delete post, grab our mutate function. Here we're going to grab our variables. The post ID is going to come from props, and the user ID is going to be the current user ID. Then we're going to call delete post. It's variables. But we also want to do a couple of things. We want to close the dialog, so we'll call on close. We want to navigate to the root route, so we need to call history.push to /, and to do that we're going to need to call use history. We're going to need to bring in the use history hook. So I'll do that by importing that from React Router DOM. History.push, and we are going to want to await and make sure that we're finished deleting a post before we navigate away. And then finally, I also want to reload the entire page with window.location.reload. So we have all of our mutations wired up in these different functions, but we need to pass down onClick to the button, onClick to onClick, and then also pass in the button text here. So let's test this out. We're going to go to a different user. I forgot to rewrite my use history hook. Let's go to a different user's page. And we're currently following them. So if we look at their post and look at the options dialog, we'll see unfollow. If we hit unfollow and reload, we should just see follow for their profile. If we go back to their profile, and we do. And if we go to our own post, we can see delete for ourselves. And let me go back to that previous user. If we go to their post, we shouldn't see anything here. Oops. And look at options dialog, we don't. So let's go to our own post and try deleting the one post that we have. And I'm also going to like and save it. And I should get a notification for it, and I do. So I have one like notification, one saved post, and one like. And then I'm going to delete this. And the post is gone. And then the notification, like, and saved post is gone. Good. So now we can move on to the last major part of our app, and that is the feed page. So we first want to make or perform a query that's going to allow us to get our entire feed. It's going to consist of all of the posts from users that we're following as well as ourselves. So the first thing that we'll do is we're going to head to app and create one new variable here. In addition to following IDs, we're going to make an array of feed IDs. And this is going to consist of both all of the users' IDs that we're following as well as ourselves. And this is so we can write a query that will include all of the posts from the users that we're following as well as our own. Whenever we make a post, we want that to show up in our feed as well. So let's spread in all of the following IDs, all of the elements in that array, and then add as the last element current user ID. And we'll provide that to the object that we're passing down on user context, feed IDs. So this is going to make writing our query very easy. And I've already written out a preliminary version of the query that's going to allow us to get our feed. And it looks just like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to include a limit for the number of posts that we want to get for our feed. And to keep things simple, I'm going to keep mine at 1 for now. We have a feed IDs array, an array of all the IDs of users that we're following, including ourselves. And we have this last timestamp value. So where is this useful? Well, let's first of all remove last timestamp. Let me copy this and remove it. And let's just see what happens when we find posts that are limited to 1, and we're finding it where the user ID is in that array of feed IDs. And it's going to be ordered from newest to oldest. So when we run this, and assuming we have an actual post, so let me add once again a new post. Let me add a different one. Let's add this one back. I'll add this. And we can re-execute the query, and we should have one post. Okay, so we have one post here, let's say there's only one post in our feed. But we want to get anything after this. So ideally, our post is going to consist of lots of different ones, up to 20 or more. And of course, the Instagram feed consists of hundreds and hundreds, thousands of posts in a feed. So we want to fetch the first set, and that's why we configure it with limit. That's our first set, and in the future you might want to set this to like 20 or 24 or something like that. That's around the number that Instagram has, 24. But for right now we can just set this to 1. But let's say we want to get the post that's after this one. What are we going to use in order to determine what comes later? Remember that we're ordering this by the created at field in descending order. It's going to be from newest to oldest. And remember from our query, suggest users, that we could find a greater than value for created at. Created at here is going to be useful to tell us to work as what's known as a cursor, to be something that we use when we re-execute our query to determine what comes after this one. So what comes after this post in an array that's ordered by the created at field in descending order, it's going to be any post that has a created at value that's less than this one. So all we need to do is add a variable storing the timestamp of the last item that we fetched, and this is it, the last timestamp, and it's going to be of type timestamp TZ. It's not going to be required because we're not going to be using this on the initial request. But what we will need to do is we will need to add to where created at where it is less than the last timestamp. And if we try to get that with this, well, of course, we're going to need to provide the last timestamp value. We won't get anything. So if this doesn't make perfect sense just yet, don't worry too much about it. it's going to be pretty clear when you see this visually. So let's take our get feed query, and all of the fields are exactly the same, almost exactly the same as those for get post. So you can literally just copy all of these with one small addition of the comments aggregate. You will need to add comments aggregate here, and then add aggregate and count. And additionally, we will want to limit the number of comments to 2 for the get feed query. So let's go to queries and add a new variable, get feed, and we'll paste that in. So again, we add comments aggregate, aggregate count, and we're going to limit our comments to 2. So now we can head to our feed page, and let's do a couple of things first. First of all, we can remove the loading variable. We can grab some data from user context. We want to grab me and current user ID. For me, we want to pass that down on the user prop to user card. And then for feed side suggestions, we want to use query. We want to bring that in so we can perform the suggest users query, and we'll create some variables. We want to limit this to 5, and we want to get when the current user was created. So again, we're going to need to read from context. Well, we could technically pass this down through props, so we could provide created at. And looking at the suggest users query, we're going to need created at, limit, and follower IDs. So we might as well just read from context here. So we'll grab here too. We'll import user context and grab me and follower IDs. So provide follower IDs as a property and value, and created at is going to be me.createdAt. And then we'll pass in variables to that query and get back data and loading, and remove this loading variable and remove the default user here. And we're going to say data.users.map. So I believe that will work. We can test that in just a second. And here, let's finish what we're doing in feed. We can use query grab get feed. And here too, we'll get back data and loading. For its variables, we're going to need to provide the feed IDs actually instead of current user ID. So just feed IDs, and we want to set the limit here to 2. We'll pass in those, and we can then replace all of the default posts that we have here with just data.posts.map. And let's see how all this turns out. We'll save everything, and I'll remove the console here so we can see what's on the right hand side. And we're getting an error. Can't read property users of undefined. And this is in the feed side suggestions. And this is because created at isn't in camel case. It's me.created_at. Okay, that looks a lot better, and we get 5 suggestions here on the right hand side. We see current user information here in the top right hand corner, and then we see a couple of posts here. Great. And we see our loading spinner at the bottom, but that's exactly what we wanted, and we can follow some other users. And once we do that, looks like we're getting an error here for following. For the follow button, yep, we need to provide the user ID here. So on the ID, we need to pass through user ID. So let's try following someone else. And when we do, our page reloads. And if we'd unfollow someone, they're removed from our feed. Good. So this is working pretty well as is. We're only fetching 2 posts. Let's follow a bunch of different users so that we can get, around 4 or 5 at least. So now the goal is to figure out when we hit the bottom of the page. Of course, we're fetching the first 2 posts, but when we hit the bottom of the page, we want to take the timestamp from the last post here and then pass it to another function that's going to allow us to fetch the next set of data. And we can do that with another function that we can destructure from useQuery, and that is called fetchMore. But before we use that, we're going to need to figure out where the page bottom is. And this is something that we might need across our app. This is something that we could use in our post page, in our post component. Say if we wanted to have an infinite scroll for our different comments there. So it's useful to have this as a separate function, and in this case a separate hook to detect when we've hit the bottom of the page and when not, when the user is scrolling. So let's create a new file here. Let's go to Explorer, then go to utils, and make a file usePageBottom. This is going to be the name of our new hook. Now, since this is a hook and we need the React API, the React Hooks API, we're going to need to import React up at the top. But this is going to be written just like a basic function, although prepended with usePageBottom. And whenever we call this in a given component, it's going to tell us when a user scrolled to the bottom or not. Simple as that. So the way that we're going to keep track of this is with state. So we're going to use some state that'll initially be false, and this variable is going to be called bottom. Setter will be setBottom. We're going to, with useEffect, add a function to it called handleScroll. What this is going to be responsible for when it's called is it's going to figure out when we've hit the bottom of the page. So within it we can make a variable isBottom, and this is going to be set equal to using page information from the window. It's going to detect whether these 2 values are equal, and if so, isBottom is going to be true. Now this isn't something that I knew beforehand. This is something that I looked up, a kind of calculation that you can use to figure out when you've scrolled to the bottom of a page. You need to compare 2 values. First of all, window.innerHeight, and you add that to document.documentElement.scrollTop and see if that's equal to document.documentElement.offsetHeight. If these 2 values are equal, isBottom is going to be true, otherwise false. And we want to set bottom with either one of those values, true or false, whatever it is. Now we want this to be called whenever a user scrolls. So the best way to do that is to set up an active listener using window.addEventListener. This is going to be a scroll event, so we'll pass scroll as the first argument, and handle scroll, a reference to the function handle scroll to call when the user is scrolling down the page. And then finally, at the very end, we want to remove this function. We want to remove this event listener if we were to move away from the page. If we are no longer scrolling through the feed, we don't want to keep calling handle scroll. Otherwise, it's going to attempt to update state on a component that is already unmounted. So we're going to return a function at the end, and this is going to allow us to unsubscribe by saying window.removeEventListener scroll handle scroll. And finally, to get the actual value of bottom and pass it to the component that we're calling this hook in, we need to return whatever the value is, bottom from state. And then, of course, we need to export default use page bottom. So now all we need to do is go to the appropriate component, feed page in this case, and call it use page bottom, and it's going to give us a true or false value, and we're going to call that or put that in a variable called isPageBottom. So now it's going to be pretty simple to set up the logic to figure out how to call this again and how to fetch more data, how to fetch our next set of posts. We're going to use effect, and if we are not at the page bottom, if not is page bottom, or if we don't have any data, we want to return. We don't want to try to fetch more data if we're not at the bottom of the page. However, this is where we're going to need fetch more. If we are at the bottom of the page, we're going to want to get the last timestamp of the last post that we loaded. In this case, this post here. It's the last in the list, so what's the timestamp of it? Well, we can get that by taking data, specifically data.posts, and to get the last element, we can select that by using the bracket syntax and saying data.post.length -1, and then off of that we want to get the created at value, created at property. Then we can construct our variables object. And what is this going to consist of? Well, it's going to require all of the same stuff that we had above, all of the variables up here. So I believe we could say, updated variables, and just spread in the variables in the outer scope, and then just add last timestamp. And then we can call fetch more. Fetch more accepts variables. But we need to tell the query how to be updated. What do we want to do when we are fetching more? I mean, it's going to fetch the next set of data, but how do we want data to look? Well, naturally, we want to append that next set of data to the previous set. So we're going to use the update query function, and we're going to pass a reference to a new function that we'll make called handle update query. And here variables is going to be set to updated variables. Hopefully that's straightforward. You could also rewrite variables here if you want. And above we're going to make handle update query, and it gets two values, previous, and for the second value provided in the second parameter, we're going to get fetch more result, and this is something we need to destructure. And then if we console log both of these, we can see exactly what they are. So let's try this out, and we're going to get an error because I didn't import use page bottom. So we need to import that from utils, and also we need to include all of the appropriate dependencies for use effect, and those are is page bottom, data, variables. Actually, I'm going to remove variables. You can use it, but we don't need it. I don't want to have to include it as a dependency. I'll just rewrite it. We'll include feed IDs and then limit 2. And we're also going to need handle update query. So now, once we save this, if we open our console, and we also need fetch more. If we open our console and then hit the bottom, we're going to see previous, which consists of an array on this posts property. And if we look at their individual properties, we'll see that, for example, for the caption or the media, that they're the same as the first two posts. So those are the previous posts in our array that we already loaded. And then the fetch more result, it has a post property, and the posts array consists of the next two posts that we want to get. So we see that that comparison with created at is working. We're getting the next two posts, the next two newest posts, and we just need to, within handle update query, provide some logic to assemble, kind of reassemble from these two values what data should be. So this is pretty straightforward. First of all, if fetch more result, if it doesn't have any additional posts, if its post length is 0, we don't want to append it to the end. We just want to return the previous data. And we also want to set the end of the feed. We can add a setter to isEndOfFeed, set end of feed, to say, don't show that loading spinner anymore. We've hit the end. Set end of feed to true. Otherwise, we want to return an object that is going to be data. So data just consists of a posts array. So we'll have a post property, and it's just going to be composed of previous.posts and fetch more result.posts. And since we're creating a new array here, we want to spread both of those arrays elements into this new one. And of course, we want to put the new post at the very end. So now let's save and see if this works. We'll scroll down and we should see the next two posts loaded, and they are. Perfect. And of course, if you had more users that you are following with more posts, I don't know if I've added any more posts here, but let me just follow all of these users. If we have any more posts, it's going to continue to load them. And then once it realizes it reaches the end, it's going to remove our loading spinner. Great. Now the next step will be to make this look a bit more presentable. We can go into feed post and make sure the appearance is what we would expect. We want to be able to see the likes. We want to see a formatted date here. And in the next step, we'll take care of actually adding the functionality to like and save posts and comment. But for right now, we just want the appearance looking better. So let's head into feed post. And first of all, we're going to destructure a number more things. Actually, there's one thing I forgot. If we take a look at the console, we're going to be warned about something. We're going to be told that for our React hook, first of all, it's missing Back in feed, it's missing feed IDs as a dependency, so we'll include that, whatever. However, if we save one more time, we're going to be warned about the handle update query function. It makes the dependencies of the useEffect hook change on every render. We can wrap it inside the useEffect, or we can put it into its own use callback hook, which is what I'm going to do. I'll wrap handle update query and use callback. I'll turn it into an arrow function. And note that to do this, we're going to need to put this above where we're calling it. We need to put it above useEffect. And one final thing that we can do is we can comment out get default post. So with that done, we can head into feed post and grab some more data from the post that we're destructuring. We can grab the comments aggregate as well as the likes aggregate and saved posts and location. So first we're going to pass location down to the user card. Then we will add that likes count variable and comments count too. So we'll make a variable likes count, and that's going to be set to likes aggregate dot count, and we'll make one called comments aggregate, well, one called comments count from comments aggregate, and we'll put them in their appropriate places. And one other value I want to get from post is created at. So here, instead of comments.length comments, it'll be comments count comments, and then for likes, for this ternary, it'll be likes count is equal to 1, and then interpolate likes count. And then instead of 5 days ago, even though we do want to use a relative date, we'll interpolate created at. And we want to format this a little bit differently. We do want it to be in the format 5 days ago. And for this, we're going to use a new date function called format distance to now. We don't need to provide two arguments here. It's going to compare the date that we pass in with the current time, with the current date, and it's going to give us a relative value like, so many seconds ago or so many months ago. To say ago, we're just going to need to provide in the configuration object add suffix true. So let's head to our format date file and export function format date to now, regular instead of short. It'll accept a date, and we're going to return the result of format distance to now. Format distance to now. Format distance to now is going to accept our date, which will in turn be passed to the date constructor. And as I mentioned, we'll have a configuration object where we just add suffix set to true, and we're going to convert this to uppercase. Then back in feed post, we will import that format date to now. And I might need to do this manually, format date to now. From format date, yeah, there we go. Okay, so we'll save all of that. There's some values that I destructured that we haven't used just yet, but up until this point, our feed post should be looking a little bit better. So our date's now formatted, and we can see the likes. So as I mentioned, we'll tackle the functionality for feed post in the next video. But one last thing that I want to do is there's one thing that we can drop in very easily to help our images load more performantly, you'll notice at the moment that they kind of jump into place and they all load ahead of time. They don't wait for us to scroll down the page, and that ultimately isn't that performant for our app. It doesn't appear performant, and it isn't in a real sense. So it would be nicer if we had a couple of things. First of all, that we had an image placeholder that took up the size of the image so it doesn't jump into place as it's loading like it does now, and then also that it was lazily loaded. The images were loaded as we looked at them, as a user looks at them, rather than all loading at the beginning. Unfortunately, there's a package that we can drop in very easily called React Graceful Image that will allow us to optionally lazy load our images and give us a placeholder, and allows us to retry loading an image if it fails. So all we have to do here is install React Graceful Image. So we'll go to a new terminal tab and we'll run npmi React Graceful Image. And once that's done, we can drop the component that it gives us very easily into both the feed post component, and into the post component. We'll just import image, capital I image, since this is a component, from React Graceful Image. And we'll head down to our image element and just swap it out with an I, capital I. And if we take a look at our feed once again, we'll see that by default it lazily loads them. So we'll see this kind of gray placeholder, which is actually a gray SVG. As we scroll down, we can see it, although they load very quickly. It kind of has a little transition effect, and it really helps with our images not jumping into place as they load. So that's a lot better. And we can do the same for our post component. We'll go up, import image from React Graceful Image, and swap out our image element with it. So if we go to an individual post, and the reason for the error in loading the post is because I'm still importing default post and options dialog. So make sure to remove that, and also make sure to, within feed post, where we're using the options dialog, make sure to pass down both the author ID, which is from user.id, and then the post ID, which is just ID. Then instead of having default post.id form the link, when we want to go to the post, instead it should just be post ID here. So once both of those errors are fixed, when we take a look at the options dialog for any post in our feed, we should first of all see delete if it's our post. If we're following a user, we should see unfollow, and then if we select go to post, we should be able to go to the actual post page.